probably the issue that persuaded me the most to be involved, to really contribute in a positive way, was the issue of war. The needless, senseless way this country goes to war, and the reasons that we ought to get this war over with as quickly as possible and get our troops home. But to my surprise, there was a lot more enthusiasm than I ever dreamed. And the numbers of people who have joined, literally now, I used to talk about tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. But we do believe that there has been literally millions of people now that have been influenced in one way or the other with the ideas of liberty and care about this country. And they do not find that our government is going to answer all our questions. The government should be there for the purpose of protecting liberty. The American people are supposed to take care of themselves. The very first time I ran for Congress was on a lark, essentially, and that was in the early 1970s. It was after the Bretton Woods monetary system broke down, and there were predictions made. Back then, gold was $35 an ounce, and there was predictions that gold could even go higher. And I remember Henry Royce, who hated the idea of sound money and gold and loved the Federal Reserve System. He says, well, if they ever legalize gold, you know, here we live in America, a free country. There were only two countries in the world where you weren't allowed to own gold, Russia and the United States. And he said, well, he says, if you guys ever get gold legalized, he says, I know what'll happen. It'll go down to $5 an ounce. I guess he was off a little bit on that. But the whole issue of monetary policy was very important because if you allow governments to first tax endlessly and then borrow endlessly, and then they still don't have enough, and allow them to print, they'll print endlessly. And I saw a great danger in that, and that motivated me to run in the 70s. Of course, the 70s were very hectic, and the 70s required the paying back for the philosophy of guns and butter of the 1960s. We had a no-win, undeclared, international-type war going on in Vietnam, a tragedy as far as I'm concerned for the friends and neighbors that I saw going over there and the loss of life. And eventually, I mean, it ended tragically. But it was an undeclared war. We didn't go to war the proper way. And then we spent all that money at the same time. LBJ told us, it doesn't matter, the money is there, we can expand the welfare state. Guns and butter was the slogan. And yet, what happened in the 70s? The war ended, and then we started needing to pay for this. And the 70s were terrible. But what we're doing today is exactly the same. We didn't learn anything. We're back to paying for guns and butter. Except this time it's much, much worse because the debt is so bad. Before, we were a creditor nation. They owed us money. Today, we owe foreigners $2.5 trillion. We can't fight the war or take care of our welfare beneficiaries in this country without borrowing about $3 billion a day, most of it coming from countries like China. It makes no sense whatsoever, and that is why we are facing this crisis, because we have a flawed foreign policy, and we have a flawed domestic policy. We have a flawed monetary policy, and it's not hard to figure out. The reason it is flawed is we have allowed our government to act by ignoring the Constitution. We need to obey the Constitution. There are some who claim that I don't sound like a Republican because I don't like to go to war. Well, it's perfectly all right to be a Republican, and it's perfectly all right to be a conservative and a constitutionalist and not want to go to war needlessly. It makes more sense that a conservative would say you only go to war when it's absolutely necessary, and you only do it in a proper manner with consent from the people by a declaration of war by the Congress and no other way. The tradition of the Republican Party has actually been much more opposed to these international conflicts than the other party. Because even in the year 2000, our current president ran on the slogan, no more nation building, no more policing of the world, and criticized Clinton for Somalia and Kosovo. But here we are doing all the things we criticized in the year 2000, only doing it much more so. The Republican Party traditionally has taken the position that we should not have these undeclared wars, and we're non-interventionists. The old Robert Taft wing of the party were civil libertarians and had a foreign policy. Robert Taft, who was known as Mr. Republican, didn't even believe we should be in NATO, believed we should be friends with the world, trade with the world, communicate with the world, but not to be the boss of the world. That's what we don't need. Unfortunately, we as a people have been offered many, many decades by both parties a foreign policy of two choices. One is that we go overseas and we tell other countries what we think they should do, and if they don't do it, we end up bombing them. And then the other option is we go overseas, tell other countries what to do, and if they do what we tell them to do, we give them money. Both ways, we bankrupt ourselves. There should be another option. Why not just talk to people, be friends with people, keep the money here at home, set a good example on civil liberties and economic prosperity? Then maybe other countries would want to emulate us, and then we wouldn't have to resort to the use of force to so-called spread our goodness around the world. You can't spread goodness through the barrel of a gun. Now, the reason foreign policy is so important today, not only because of the damage done, with life and limbs that are lost, but the financial obligation. It can't be maintained. It's coming to an end. All great empires end for financial reasons, not military reasons. The Roman Empire ended really because they had bread and circuses, and they finally bankrupted themselves. How did the Soviet system collapse? I mean, I was called to military duty in the early 1960s during the Cuban crisis, and I served 5 years in the military. But today, though, we really face some serious trouble because we have overextended ourselves so much that we have bankrupted our country. And we will do the same thing as the Soviets. We did not have to confront the Soviets in the 60s or the 70s. They just faded away for economic reasons. That is what's happening to our country today. It's the economic attack on ourselves by our own flawed policies. And it is reflected in the most important measurement. If you want to measure foreign policy and if you want to measure the strength of our economy, look at the value of the dollar. And the value of the dollar on international exchange market is going down rapidly. And what does that mean? When the dollar goes down internationally, it means that inflation is around the corner. Matter of fact, it's marching on us right now. Inflation rates are much higher than the government will admit. They're not at 2 or 3%. The average person now, especially the retirees, Social Security recipients, are having to face an inflation rate of probably 10 to 15%. So the government says it's 3%, and they give them a token increase, and then they wonder why the people are unhappy. Do wages ever keep up with inflation? They never do. What happens when you destroy a currency, you transfer wealth. The wealth is transferred from the middle class to the wealthy. Countries that are perpetual inflators have no middle class. And we are systematically destroying our middle class today because of this depreciation of our money. And this continues because American people so far have not been willing to send only individuals to Washington who will live within our means and live within the Constitution. That is what we need. Today, to operate our empire around the world costs us $1 trillion to put the whole thing together. They won't admit that because they'll say the DOD budget is only $500 or $600 billion. But when you add it all up in the State Department, all the foreign aid and all the interest costs, it's very, very expensive. Just like Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, says now that his estimate of